On the morning of August 29th, 1930, an island gave up. 36 people walked down to the jetty at Village Bay on Hirta, the main island of St Kilda, 40 miles out in the open Atlantic. In each house they left a small heap of oats and an open Bible. Then the last St Kildans sailed away from a place their people had held for 4,000 years. The houses they abandoned are roofless shells today, but look past the houses. Scattered across the same hillsides stand more than 1,000 small stone huts, many of them centuries older. A surprising number are still dry inside. No mortar, no cement, walls you can see daylight through. The sealed modern homes died within a lifetime. The huts full of holes did not. Tonight we pull these huts apart. What they were for, how a wall with holes in it beats the Atlantic, and why the island they fed emptied anyway. Hirta, long before anyone wrote its name down. Picture the most remote inhabited place in the British Isles. A cluster of volcanic islands and sea stacks so far west of the Outer Hebrides that on most days you cannot see any other land at all. The cliffs of Connacher drop nearly 1,400 feet straight into the sea, the highest sea cliffs in Britain. There are no trees. There have never been trees in anyone's memory. On the neighbouring island of Soy lives a breed of small brown sheep, so old it has barely changed since the Bronze Age. And over everything, always, the wind. St Kilda is one of the windiest places in Europe, and winter gusts well over 100 miles per hour are simply part of the calendar. Now try to feed a village there. The soil is a thin skin over rock, and every gale throws salt spray across the whole island, burning the crops it lands on. Oats and barley grew, badly, in good years. The sea around the islands is full of fish, but for most of the year it is also full of swell that will kill you, and the islanders owned small open boats and no harbour worth the name. Visitors were always puzzled by how little the St Kildans fished. The islanders were not puzzled. They had done the arithmetic on drowning. The food was not in the ground and not in the water. It was overhead. St Kilda holds the largest seabird colony in the northeast Atlantic. Borray and its two great stacks carry the biggest northern gannet colony on Earth, roughly 60,000 pairs of them today, and in summer the cliffs of Hirta fill with fulmars and puffins beyond counting. When the traveller Martin visited in 1697, he recorded the harvest for that season. 22,600 gannets. That is not a typo, by the way. One village, a few dozen able men, no firearms that mattered, and they brought more than 20,000 large seabirds off some of the most violent rock faces in Europe. They did it barefoot, on ropes of twisted horsehair, climbing at night onto ledges where the birds slept. A St Kildan man was, functionally, a professional cliff climber who also farmed a little. Boys learned the rock the way other children learned to walk to school. A good rope was one of the most valuable objects a family owned, handed down like land, because a family's rope was quite literally its income. Visitors wrote about the islanders' feet the way you might describe a specialised tool, broad and gripping, shaped by a lifetime on wet stone. The birds were meat, the eggs were food, the fat was lamp oil and medicine, and the feathers paid the rent to the landlord's agent across the water. One species even doubled as a lamp. A fulmar carries a stomach full of oil, and the islanders burned it through the winter. The work was organised with a formality that surprised every visitor who saw it. Each morning the men gathered in the village street, in a meeting the Victorians nicknamed the St Kilda Parliament, and talked through the day's work until everyone agreed. Which cliff? Which crew? Whose cattle? Whose wall? No chairman, no votes, no hurry. It looks charming in the old photographs, a row of bearded men leaning on the wall like they have all the time in the world. It was actually load-bearing government. On rock like that, in weather like that, an argument left unsettled could put the wrong man on the wrong rope. Consensus was a safety system, but a cliff full of birds in June is worth nothing in January. That was the real problem, and it is a harder problem than climbing. The seabird harvest arrives in a few short windows through spring and summer. Winter on Hirta lasts most of the year, and no boat might call for months. Everything the island would eat in the dark had to be caught in the light, and then somehow kept. Kept how, though? The two normal answers were closed to them. Salting needs salt, and salt came by boat, and the boat came once or twice a year if it came at all. Just how thin that thread was shows in the islanders' emergency postal service. When they urgently needed the mainland, they carved a small wooden boat, sealed a letter inside, tied it to an inflated sheep's bladder, and threw it into the sea, trusting the current to land it in Scotland or Norway. Astonishingly, most of these St Kilda mailboats were eventually found and delivered. That was the supply line. Smoking, the other answer, needs fuel, and an island without a single tree guards its peat like money. A village that burned its fuel-preserving food would freeze in February with a full larder. Every option cost something the island did not have. Except one thing. The island had wind in a surplus no place in Britain could match. The same force that burned the crops and forbade the fishing was, if you could harness it, a preservative. Wind pulls moisture out of meat, and dry meat does not rot. The St Kildans did not fight their worst enemy. They hired it. The tool they built for the job is called a cleat. Two thick dry stone walls, leaning slightly inward, laid up without a drop of mortar. Big flat slabs across the top for a roof, and over the slabs a cap of turf and earth, growing grass like a small green hill. Inside, a dark chamber about the size of a garden shed, and the whole point of the building is the part that looks like bad workmanship. The walls are deliberately full of gaps. Rain hits the turf cap and runs off. Wind hits the wall and goes straight through, over everything stored inside and out the other side. A cleat is not a shed. It is a dehydrator with no moving parts, powered by an Atlantic gale. Split a bird, hang it, or lay it on stones inside, and the wind does the rest. Meat cured this way, with little or no salt, kept for months. Visitors who tasted wind-dried fulmar mostly did not ask for seconds, and the islanders did not care because the standard they were cooking to was February, not flavour. Eggs went into cleat, packed in peat ash, and stayed edible deep into winter. Hay dried in there when the weather refused to make hay outside. Peat turfs dried in there too, along with grain, climbing ropes, tools, and lambs in a bad storm. Even the placement of the buildings tells you what they were. Cleatian cluster near the village for the goods a household reached for daily, and stand alone out by the cliffs and grazing grounds, so a harvest could be stored where it was won instead of hauled home wet. The islanders had built themselves an artificial cave system tuned to the one resource they had too much of, and they built it at a scale that still stuns the people who survey it. Archaeologists have counted about 1,260 Cleatian on Hirta alone, with well over 100 more on the outer islands and stacks. There are Cleatian on ledges partway down cliffs, and Cleatian on the summits of sea stacks that modern climbers rope up to reach. For a village that never held much more than 180 people, that is several huts for every man, woman, and child. Spread across the map, the whole island is a larder. To a stranger coming ashore, the slopes read like the ruins of some vanished crowd. Hundreds of little stone beehives climbing the hills above a single short street. But almost none of them were ever homes. They were pantries, and the crowd they were built for had wings. For centuries, the system simply worked. Then the modern world decided to improve it, and accidentally ran the experiment that proves what these huts were. In October 1860, a hurricane-force storm tore through Village Bay, wrecking roofs and flattening the crops. Money was raised on the mainland, and over the next 2 years the village got a brand new street, 16 modern cottages, straight gabled walls bound with lime mortar, and clean zinc roofs. Sealed, solid, respectable houses, the kind being built across Victorian Britain, lined up neatly above the bay like a promise that the 19th century had finally arrived. Against them, the old buildings looked like exactly what reformers said they were: dark, smoky, half-buried heaps. This upgrade seemed like an obvious kindness at the time. It carried a flaw nobody could see. It turns out a sealed house on St Kilda is a trap for water. The salt gale stripped and corroded the zinc until the roofs had to be covered over with tarred felt. Rain drove into the mortar joints and stayed there. Inside, warm breath met cold hard walls and ran down them as condensation. Islanders complained of houses that were colder and damper than the thick old turf and stone black houses they had left, and kept using the old buildings alongside the new. Meanwhile, on the hillside above the new street, huts with no mortar at all stood through the same storms and stayed dry inside. Nobody repaired them into surviving. They survived by design. The building that let the island through its walls beat the building that tried to keep it out. Walk Village Bay today, and the verdict is carved in stone. The 1860s cottages stand as roofless shells, except the few that modern conservators have rebuilt. Plenty of Cleatian, some of them centuries older than the cottages, still carry their turf caps and still shed rain. Where a cap has finally slumped, the hut is slowly going too, because the design was never magic, just correct. But hundreds still hold, on an island that has been mostly empty for nearly a century. There is something worth taking personally in that. A crofter with no engineering degree, no drawings, and no budget solved a materials problem that still defeats buildings today, using patience and the stones under his feet. That habit of making things with your own hands did not die with him. If this makes you want to put your own hands on the past instead of just watching it, that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store. It starts with the Medieval Bakery Collection, the practical recipes book for the dishes themselves, the sourdough manual for building and keeping a living leaven the old way, and the sourcing guide for finding real heritage grain. The bread is where this kitchen begins. Back on the hillside, the question is still hanging. Why does the wall full of holes win? A storm attacks a building with two weapons, pressure and water. When a gust hits a sealed gable, the wall takes the full load, and the suction on the far side pulls at the roof like a hand. When the same gust hits a dry stone wall, part of the wind bleeds through the gaps, the pressure evens out, and there is far less for the storm to grip. The cleat fights less, so it breaks less. Water is the slower kill and the more interesting one. A mortared wall is only sealed until its first crack, and on a freezing coast a crack is a promise. Water gets in, has nowhere to go, freezes, and pries the joint wider every winter. The wall stores its damage. A dry stone wall cannot store damage that way. Rain that blows into it drains straight down and out. The wind dries the core between storms, and every joint can shift a hair and settle again as the ground heaves. One design accumulates its injuries. The other sheds them. The turf cap is doing quieter work of the same kind. A rigid roof gives a gale an edge to grab, and once one sheet or slate lifts, the storm unzips the rest. A living cap of turf has no edges, adds a settled deadweight that presses the roof slabs down onto the walls and heals its own small wounds by growing. It even manages water like a modern engineered roof, soaking up a downpour and releasing it slowly instead of sheeting it into the joints. None of this was theory to the builders. It was just what a hut looked like when the failures had been cold for 100 generations. Every cleat standing today is the descendant of huts that fell. That is not a quaint historical footnote. Damp is still the quiet failure mode of British housing. In England alone, government surveys put roughly 900,000 homes with a damp problem right now, and moisture trapped inside sealed walls is a major reason new houses need serious repair within decades. The cleat builders never wrote down a theory of moisture. They just never built a place for water to hide. And here is where honesty matters, because this channel does not sell nostalgia. The system these huts served was as hard as the stone. The men paid for the bird harvest in falls, and the cliffs took lives right through the island's history. Worse was waiting in the cradle. Through the middle of the 1800s, St Kilda suffered the horror the islanders called the 8-day sickness. Newborn after newborn died of infant tetanus in the first 2 weeks of life. In some decades, most of the babies born on the island. The likeliest cause was infection of the cord, possibly from the fulmar oil dressing used at births, and it only ended when a trained nurse changed the practice late in the century. The huts could keep meat alive through winter. They could not do the same for children. The island had always lived one bad season from the edge, and it knew it. In 1727, smallpox came ashore in the clothes of an islander who had died of it on the mainland, and it burned through the village. When it was over, only a few adults and a scatter of children were left alive on Hirta. The strangest part is who survived best. A work party of 3 men and 8 boys had been landed on the bare rock of Stack and Armin to harvest gannets just before the outbreak, and with the village too sick to fetch them, they were marooned out there for 9 months, living in the stone shelters on the Stack, on the birds and rainwater. The pestilence never reached them. On St Kilda, even quarantine was made of dry stone. After that, the story tightens like a rope. In 1852, 36 islanders, a third of the population, emigrated for Australia, and around half of them died of disease on the way. Steamers began calling in the 1870s with tourists, cash, and infections the islanders had no defences against. Money changed what the island wanted, and every young St Kildan who saw the mainland had a harder time coming home. The First World War brought a naval wireless station, daily contact, and wages. It also brought the only battle in the island's 4,000 years. One morning in May 1918, a German submarine surfaced in Village Bay and shelled the wireless station, throwing dozens of rounds into a village that had never seen a weapon bigger than a fowling rope. Buildings were smashed, a lamb was reported among the casualties, and not one human being was killed. Even the Kaiser's navy, it turned out, could not do much to a settlement made mostly of stacked stone. Then the war ended, the navy left, and the silence afterward was a new kind of loud. The flu of 1926 killed 4 of the remaining men. Harvests failed. By 1930 there were 36 people left, not enough young backs to work the cliffs, and the islanders themselves petitioned the government to take them off. Which brings us back to that August morning, the oats and the open Bibles, and one last dry irony. The government found mainland work for several of the St Kildan men in forestry, planting trees. They came from an island that had none. Somebody in an office decided that was a natural fit. Today, St Kilda belongs to the National Trust for Scotland, and it holds a distinction almost nothing on earth holds. UNESCO, World Heritage status for both its nature and its human story. The Soay sheep run wild now, and in bad weather they shelter where the food once did, inside the Cleatian. Work parties sail out each summer to reset stones and mend turf caps. The houses needed people, and the people are gone. The Cleatian only ever needed the wind, and the wind has never once failed to arrive. The huts are still doing their job. There is just no one left to feed. Subscribe for more buildings that refuse to die. Sealed cottage or hut full of holes. Which one do you trust in a storm? Tell me below. Build to last.